In the middle of a small member birthday party, Jungkook gives Jimin his only gift, a secret letter that makes Jimin's eyes fall silent and his heart no longer the same. At a quiet birthday party, Jungkook gives Jimin a secret letter that changes everything, revealing feelings, fears, and a truth that reshapes their hearts. I shouldn't be giving this to you tonight. The words slipped out of Jungkook's mouth just as the candles on the cake flickered in the dim light of the small living room. Laughter still hung in the air, warm and careless, the kind of laughter that only came from people who believed nothing serious could happen on an ordinary night. The apartment smelled like vanilla frosting and melted wax. Balloons floated lazily near the ceiling, their ribbons brushing against the lamp every time someone walked past. Music from an old speaker hummed softly in the background, barely louder than the chatter of the group gathered around the table. Jimin froze. The cake knife was still in his hand. For a moment, he thought Jungkook was joking. Jungkook often spoke quietly, sometimes dramatically, especially when he was nervous. But when Jimin looked up, he saw something that made the air inside his lungs tighten. Jungkook wasn't smiling. His dark eyes held a strange stillness, like a lake before a storm. Hyung, Jungkook said again, softer this time, "Take it." In his hand was a small folded envelope. It looked ordinary, cream-colored, slightly wrinkled, as if it had been carried around in someone's pocket for too long. Jimin blinked. "What is it?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Behind them, Taehyung was arguing loudly with Hoseok about who had eaten the last strawberry from the cake decoration. Namjoon was laughing so hard he had leaned against the wall. The noise of their friends filled the room like a blanket, making the moment between Jungkook and Jimin feel oddly private. Jungkook stepped closer. Close enough that Jimin could see the faint crease between his brows. "A gift," Jungkook said. Jimin looked down at the envelope again. "That's it?" he asked. "No dramatic speech, no embarrassing story about me." Jungkook's lips twitched slightly. "You already embarrass yourself enough." Jimin laughed softly, but the tension didn't leave Jungkook's shoulders. Something was wrong. Jimin had known Jungkook for years, long enough to recognize the small signs. The way Jungkook rubbed his thumb against the edge of the envelope, the way his breathing seemed just a little too controlled. Jimin wiped frosting from his fingers and took the envelope. It was warm, as if Jungkook had been holding it for a long time. "Should I open it now?" Jimin asked. Jungkook hesitated. For a brief second, fear flickered across his face. "Yes," he said. The room erupted into cheers behind them as someone finally cut the cake. "Birthday boy speech," Hoseok shouted. Jimin ignored them. He slid a finger beneath the envelope flap and slowly pulled out the letter inside. The paper was thick. Handwritten. Jungkook's handwriting was instantly recognizable, strong, slightly slanted, careful but emotional. Jimin began to read. The music faded into the background. The voices around him blurred into distant noise. "Dear Jimin Hyung, if you're reading this, it means I finally gathered enough courage to give it to you." Jimin felt his chest tighten. He glanced up at Jungkook, who was staring at the floor. "I tried to tell you many times. I practiced the words in my head during long nights and quiet car rides, but every time you smiled at me, I lost the courage." Jimin's heartbeat slowed strangely. "I don't know when it started. Maybe the night you stayed awake with me when I couldn't sleep. Maybe the day you told me I didn't need to be perfect all the time. Maybe it was the way you always look at people like you can see their pain even when they hide it." Jimin swallowed. He could hear the laughter of their friends behind him again, the clink of forks against plates, someone turning the music louder. The world around him continued as normal. But inside his chest, something had shifted. "I know things like this can change everything. That's why I wrote it instead of saying it." Jimin's fingers trembled slightly. "Because if I said it out loud and saw disappointment in your eyes, I think I wouldn't survive it." Jimin stopped breathing. "So I'll just write the truth here." He reached the final line. And when he read it, the room went completely silent inside his mind. "I think I've been in love with you for a long time." Jimin lowered the letter slowly. The party continued behind him, bright and loud. But Jungkook stood in front of him like someone waiting for a verdict. Jimin looked up. Their eyes met. And in that quiet second, Jungkook's usual confidence was gone. All that remained was a kind of fragile honesty Jimin had never seen before. Jimin's throat felt dry. "You wrote this today?" he asked softly. Jungkook shook his head. "No." "How long ago?" Jungkook exhaled slowly. 3 months. Jimin blinked. "You carried it for 3 months." Jungkook nodded. "I almost threw it away yesterday." "Why didn't you?" Jungkook finally met his eyes. "Because you looked at me today the same way you always do," he said, "like I matter." Jimin's chest tightened. He looked back down at the letter, reading the final sentence again. "I don't expect anything from you, I just wanted you to know the truth." The simplicity of it hurt more than any dramatic confession could have. Jimin realized something strange then. The noise of the party no longer felt comforting. It felt distant. Like he had stepped into another version of the night where everything had quietly changed. He folded the letter carefully. For a moment he didn't speak. Jungkook's hands were shaking slightly now. "If you want," Jungkook said quietly, "you can pretend you never read it." Jimin looked up immediately. "Why would I do that?" Jungkook shrugged, but the movement felt heavy. "Because things might get awkward." Jimin stared at him. Then unexpectedly he laughed. Not loudly. Just a soft, breathless sound. "You waited 3 months," Jimin said, "and the first thing you worry about is awkwardness." Jungkook rubbed the back of his neck. "I'm being realistic." Jimin studied his face. The same face he had seen almost every day for years. But tonight something felt different. Not because Jungkook had changed, but because Jimin suddenly realized how much he had never noticed before. The way Jungkook watched him carefully. The way his eyes softened when Jimin spoke. The quiet patience in his presence. A warmth spread slowly through Jimin's chest, confusing and unfamiliar. Behind them, Taehyung suddenly shouted, "Jimin, stop flirting and come eat cake." The room burst into laughter. Jimin smiled automatically. But his gaze never left Jungkook. "Hey," Jimin said softly. Jungkook looked nervous again. "Yes." Jimin held up the letter. "You gave me the most dangerous birthday gift possible." Jungkook frowned slightly. "Dangerous?" Jimin nodded. "Yeah." He placed the letter carefully in his pocket. "Because now my heart won't be the same either." For a moment Jungkook didn't move. And then something in his expression softened, like a door opening slowly after being locked for a very long time. The music grew louder. The party continued. But somewhere in the quiet space between them, something fragile and new had begun to exist. "Because now my heart won't be the same either." For a moment, Jungkook didn't understand what Jimin meant. The noise of the party rushed back into the room all at once, forks clinking against plates, Taehyung laughing too loudly, Namjoon trying to light a sparkler that refused to cooperate. But Jungkook stood perfectly still, staring at Jimin as if the words had physically stopped him from breathing. "What does that mean?" Jungkook asked quietly. Jimin tilted his head slightly, studying him. "You're the one who wrote a dramatic confession," Jimin said. "Why are you suddenly the nervous one?" "I was always the nervous one." "That's true," Jimin admitted softly. Jungkook's hands slid into his pockets, a habit he had whenever he felt exposed. His shoulders were tense again. "Hyung," he said, voice low, "don't joke about it." Jimin's smile faded. "I'm not joking." For a second, neither of them spoke. Across the room, Hoseok suddenly shouted, "Why are you two standing there like you're in a sad movie scene?" Taehyung leaned over the table and squinted at them. "Oh my god," he said slowly, "did Jungkook finally confess something?" The room went quiet. Jimin's eyes widened. Jungkook nearly choked. "What?" Jungkook snapped. Taehyung grinned like a detective who had just solved a mystery. "I knew it," he said triumphantly. Namjoon blinked in confusion. "Knew what?" Taehyung pointed dramatically at Jungkook. "This guy has been acting weird around Jimin for years." "Years?" Hoseok gasped. "Wait, this is a long-term secret." Jungkook's ears turned bright red. "Stop talking," he muttered. Jimin suddenly burst into laughter. It came out unexpectedly loud, echoing through the room. "Wow," Jimin said between breaths, "you guys really don't miss anything." Taehyung leaned closer, eyes sparkling with curiosity. So he said, what did he confess? Jungkook looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Nothing, he said quickly. Jimin slowly pulled the folded letter from his pocket again. Actually, Jimin said, waving it slightly, he wrote me a birthday letter. The group immediately leaned forward like a pack of wolves who smelled drama. Hoseok slapped the table, read it. No, Jungkook said instantly. Jimin glanced at him. Relax, Jimin said calmly, I'm not reading it out loud. Taehyung pouted. That's cruel. Namjoon looked thoughtful. A handwritten letter though, he said, that's serious effort. Jungkook groaned and dragged a hand down his face. This is why I didn't want to give it tonight. Jimin watched him carefully. You almost didn't give it. No. Why tonight then? Jungkook hesitated. The room waited. Even Taehyung stopped joking. Finally Jungkook shrugged slightly. Because it was your birthday, he said quietly. Jimin's expression softened. That's your logic. If it went badly, Jungkook said, at least you'd still have cake. Taehyung choked on his drink. That's the saddest strategy I've ever heard. Hoseok pointed at Jungkook dramatically. You're in love, aren't you? Jungkook froze. The room exploded. What? Taehyung yelled. Namjoon dropped his fork. Jimin's eyes widened as he looked at Hoseok. How did you guess that? Jungkook turned slowly toward Jimin, looking betrayed. You told them. I didn't say anything, Jimin said quickly. Hoseok blinked. Wait, I guessed right. Taehyung slammed both hands on the table. No way. Namjoon stared at Jungkook like he had just discovered a plot twist in a novel. Jungkook, he said carefully, is this real? Jungkook closed his eyes. Can we please stop discussing my emotional collapse during a birthday party? Taehyung grinned wickedly. So it is asterisk real. Jimin suddenly raised his hand like a teacher stopping a chaotic classroom. Okay, calm down, he said. Everyone looked at him. Jimin's voice was steady, but something in his expression had changed. This isn't a group discussion, he said. Taehyung tilted his head. Are you rejecting him privately then? Jungkook looked like he had been punched. Taehyung, Namjoon sighed. Jimin turned slowly toward Taehyung. I didn't reject him. The room fell silent again. Jungkook stared at him. You did. Jimin shrugged slightly. I haven't decided what to do yet. Hoseok leaned forward dramatically. Oh, this is getting intense. Taehyung grinned, I love this party. Jungkook looked at Jimin again, more seriously now. You don't have to decide anything, he said. Jimin raised an eyebrow. That's a lie. Jungkook hesitated. Okay, maybe a small decision. Jimin laughed quietly. You're terrible at pretending to be calm. Because I'm not calm. Jimin studied him again, more deeply this time. Something about Jungkook felt painfully sincere tonight. Not the confident performer everyone knew. Just a young man standing there with his heart completely exposed. Jimin felt the letter in his hand again. The weight of those words. 3 months. Jungkook had carried that truth for 3 months. Come here, Jimin said suddenly. Jungkook blinked. What? Outside, Jimin said, we should talk somewhere quieter. Taehyung gasped dramatically. Oh my god, they're having a secret conversation. Hoseok clapped. This party just became a romance drama. Namjoon rubbed his temples. Please don't traumatize Jungkook more than necessary. Jimin rolled his eyes. You guys are unbelievable. He grabbed Jungkook's wrist lightly and pulled him toward the door. The night air outside was cool and quiet. The door closed behind them, muting the chaos inside the apartment. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Streetlights painted soft gold across the empty sidewalk. Jungkook leaned against the railing of the small balcony, staring down at the street below. Sorry about that, he muttered. Jimin crossed his arms. Why? For turning your birthday into whatever that was. Jimin smiled faintly. My birthdays are usually boring, he said. This one is definitely memorable. Jungkook glanced at him. That's not reassuring. Jimin took a slow breath. Jungkook. Yes. Look at me. Jungkook lifted his head slowly. Their eyes met again. Why me? Jimin asked quietly. Jungkook frowned slightly. What do you mean? You're Jungkook, Jimin said. You could fall in love with almost anyone. Jungkook stared at him like the question made no sense. That's not how love works. Maybe not, Jimin said, but I'm still asking. Jungkook looked away briefly. His jaw tightened as if he were deciding whether to reveal something deeper. Finally he spoke. You're the only person who ever made me feel like I didn't have to compete with the world, he said. Jimin blinked. When I'm around you, Jungkook continued slowly, I'm not trying to prove anything. The honesty in his voice made Jimin's chest ache. And that scares you? Jimin asked. Jungkook laughed quietly. It terrifies me. Jimin stepped a little closer. The streetlight caught the softness in his eyes. You know something funny, Jimin said. What? I always thought you were fearless. Jungkook shook his head. Not with you. Jimin looked down at the letter again. His thumb brushed the folded edge. Jungkook, he said softly. Yes. You really changed something tonight. Jungkook's heart began racing again. In a good way. Jimin looked up slowly. I don't know yet. The honesty of the answer hung between them in the cool night air. But something in Jimin's gaze had softened in a way Jungkook had never seen before. And for the first time since giving the letter, Jungkook felt a fragile, dangerous hope beginning to grow. You really don't know yet. Jungkook's voice came out quieter than he intended. The cool night air pressed against the small balcony, carrying distant sounds of traffic and laughter from the apartment behind them. Through the slightly open window, the muffled chaos of the birthday party continued, Taehyung yelling something dramatic, Hoseok laughing too loudly, Namjoon trying to restore order like a tired leader of a circus. But out here the world felt strangely still. Jimin leaned against the railing, staring down at the quiet street below. I said I don't know yet, he repeated calmly. Jungkook watched him carefully. That's worse than rejection. Jimin glanced sideways at him. You'd rather I rejected you. At least it would be clear. Jimin let out a soft breath. You want clarity after dropping a 3-month emotional bomb on my birthday. Jungkook rubbed the back of his neck. When you say it like that, it sounds manipulative. It is * manipulative. Jungkook looked genuinely startled. That wasn't the plan. Jimin finally turned toward him fully. The streetlight caught the sharp line of his jaw, the quiet seriousness in his eyes. Jungkook, he said, voice lower now, do you understand what you wrote in that letter? Yes. You said you've been in love with me. Yes. For how long? Jungkook hesitated. Jimin noticed immediately. How long? Jimin repeated. Jungkook exhaled slowly. Almost 2 years. The words hit the air like a dropped glass. Jimin's expression changed. 2 years. Jungkook nodded once. Yes. Jimin let out a stunned laugh. You're unbelievable. Jungkook frowned slightly. That's not usually the reaction people hope for after confessing. You hid it for 2 years. I tried not to feel it. That's not how feelings work. I know. Jimin ran a hand through his hair, packing once across the small balcony. 2 years, he repeated quietly. He suddenly stopped walking. Wait. Jungkook stiffened. What? Jimin turned slowly. Does everyone else know? Jungkook blinked. What? Taehyung seemed suspicious, Jimin said, and Hoseok guessed way too fast. Jungkook groaned softly. No one knew for sure. For sure. Jungkook hesitated again. Jimin narrowed his eyes. Jungkook. Jungkook sighed. Namjoon might have suspected. Jimin's jaw dropped. You told Namjoon. I didn't tell him, Jungkook said quickly, he just reads people. Jimin stared at him like the situation was getting more absurd by the second. So let me understand this, Jimin said slowly. For 2 years you've been in love with me, possibly Namjoon knows, Taehyung suspects, Hoseok somehow guessed within 10 seconds. Jungkook winced. When you summarize it like that, it sounds really bad. It is bad. Why? Jimin threw his hands up. Because I'm the only one who didn't know. Jungkook looked down at the ground. That was the point. Jimin stared at him. Silence stretched between them again. Then Jimin suddenly laughed again, but this time the sound was more emotional. You idiot, he said softly. Jungkook blinked. That sounded affectionate. It was half affectionate. Only half. Jimin stepped closer now. Close enough that Jungkook could see the faint tension in his eyes. You think hiding something like that protects people? Jimin asked quietly. I thought it protected you. From what? Jungkook swallowed. From feeling uncomfortable around me. Jimin stared at him for a long moment. Then he shook his head slowly. You really don't understand me at all. Jungkook's chest tightened. That's not true. It is, Jimin said, because if you understood me you would know something important. What? Jimin's voice softened slightly. I hate being lied to. Jungkook looked up quickly. I didn't lie. You hid the truth. That's different. Jimin raised an eyebrow. Not to me. Jungkook felt something twist in his chest. I was scared, he said quietly. Jimin's expression softened just a little. Of me. Of losing you. The words hung heavily between them. Jimin's gaze dropped briefly to the letter still in his hand. You really thought telling me would make me disappear from your life. I didn't know what would happen. And that was worse than hiding it. Jungkook didn't answer. Because the truth was complicated. Jimin sighed softly. You're frustrating. I've been told that before. But you're also, Jimin paused. Jungkook waited. Brave. Jungkook blinked. That's the first time anyone called me brave for confessing. You wrote a letter admitting something that could destroy your friendship, Jimin said. That takes courage. Jungkook looked at him carefully. Does it feel destroyed? Jimin thought for a moment. No. Jungkook exhaled slowly. Relief flickered briefly across his face. But Jimin wasn't finished. It feels different. Jungkook nodded slightly. I expected that. Jimin stepped closer again, leaning his elbows on the railing beside Jungkook. For a moment they both looked out at the quiet street. You said something earlier, Jimin said after a while. What? You said your heart wouldn't survive seeing disappointment in my eyes. Jungkook laughed softly. Yeah. Jimin turned toward him again. What if the problem isn't disappointment? Jungkook frowned slightly. What do you mean? Jimin hesitated. For the first time tonight, he seemed unsure of his own words. What if the problem, Jimin said slowly, is that I'm not as shocked as I should be? Jungkook stared at him. What? Jimin looked away quickly. Forget it. No, Jungkook said immediately, explain that. Jimin rubbed his temples. This is exactly why I didn't want to have this conversation outside in the cold. You started the conversation. Because you dropped a love confession during cake cutting. Jungkook couldn't argue with that. Jimin sighed again. Fine. He turned back toward Jungkook. You want honesty? Yes. Complete honesty. Yes. Jimin studied his face carefully. You've been looking at me differently for a long time. Jungkook froze. And I noticed. Jungkook's heart began racing again. You noticed? Yes. Then why didn't you say anything? Jimin shrugged slightly. Because I wasn't sure what it meant. And now? Jimin held up the letter. Now I know. Jungkook stared at him stunned. You knew something was happening and you never asked. I thought maybe I was imagining it. Jungkook ran both hands through his hair in disbelief. So this entire time? Yes, Jimin interrupted. You just watched me suffer silently. Jimin smirked faintly. I didn't realize you were suffering. Jungkook groaned. You're cruel. Jimin laughed softly. Maybe. Then his expression grew serious again. But there's something else you should know. Jungkook looked at him carefully. What? Jimin's voice dropped slightly. I didn't stop you. Jungkook blinked. What? I noticed the way you looked at me, Jimin said, and I didn't create distance. Jungkook felt his heartbeat spike. Why? Jimin's fingers tightened slightly around the letter. That's the part I'm still figuring out. Jungkook searched his face for clues. Jimin. Yes. Are you saying you might feel something too? Jimin opened his mouth. Then suddenly the balcony door burst open. Taehyung leaned outside dramatically. There you two are. Jimin groaned. What now? Taehyung grinned widely. You guys have been gone for 20 minutes. So, so the party has evolved. Jungkook frowned. What does that mean? Taehyung pointed inside the apartment. It means everyone inside is now arguing about whether you two are secretly dating. Jimin's eyes widened. They what? Taehyung shrugged. Hoseok started it. Jungkook covered his face with both hands. This is a nightmare. Taehyung leaned closer, lowering his voice conspiratorially. But the real reason I came out here. Jimin sighed. What is it? Taehyung's grin slowly faded into something more serious. There's someone inside asking for you. Jimin frowned. For me? Taehyung nodded. Yeah. Who? Taehyung glanced briefly at Jungkook. Then he said quietly. Your ex. Jimin's entire body went still. Jungkook's stomach dropped instantly. And suddenly the night that had already been complicated began twisting into something far more dangerous. My ex, Jimin repeated slowly. For a moment the word itself felt unreal, like something dragged out of a memory that should have stayed buried. The quiet night air on the balcony suddenly felt colder. Taehyung nodded, his expression unusually serious. Yeah, he said, your ex. Jungkook felt something sharp twist in his stomach. He didn't move, but the tension in his shoulders became visible. Jimin noticed. But he didn't say anything about it. Instead he turned back toward Taehyung. Which one? Jimin asked calmly. Taehyung blinked. How many do you have? Jimin gave him a flat look. Answer the question. Taehyung rubbed the back of his neck. It's Minseo. The name landed heavily in the air. Jimin's expression froze. Jungkook felt his pulse spike instantly. Minseo. Even Jungkook knew that name. Everyone did. Not because she was famous, but because of how badly things had ended. Jimin exhaled slowly through his nose. Why is she here? He asked. Taehyung shrugged awkwardly. She just showed up. You let her inside. Hearing the edge in Jimin's voice made Taehyung wince. She said she needed to talk to you, Taehyung explained, and she looked serious. Jimin closed his eyes briefly. Behind them, the muffled sounds of the party continued, but now the atmosphere had changed. Even through the door, Jungkook could sense the tension inside the apartment. Jungkook finally spoke. Does she know it's your birthday? Taehyung nodded. Yeah. Jimin let out a dry laugh. Of course she does. Jungkook watched him carefully. You don't look happy to see her. That's the most obvious statement of the night, Jimin said quietly. Taehyung shifted his weight. She's sitting on the couch with Namjoon right now. Jimin's eyebrows lifted slightly. And Namjoon didn't throw her out. Taehyung sighed. She said it was important. Jimin looked toward the balcony door. For a moment he didn't move. Then he ran a hand through his hair and straightened. All right, he said quietly. Jungkook felt his chest tighten. You're going to talk to her? Yes. Jungkook tried to keep his voice neutral. Now. Jimin glanced at him. She didn't come here for cake. Taehyung slowly stepped aside, opening the door wider. Jimin took one step toward the apartment. Then he paused. He turned slightly toward Jungkook. Their eyes met. Jungkook didn't say anything, but the tension in his expression was obvious. Jimin studied him for a second. Relax, Jimin said softly. I am relaxed. That's a lie. Jungkook gave a faint smile. Maybe a little. Jimin hesitated. Then he leaned closer and spoke quietly enough that Taehyung couldn't hear. This conversation with Minseo has nothing to do with the letter. Jungkook's heart skipped. You're sure? Yes. Jimin held his gaze for another second. Don't disappear while I'm inside. Jungkook frowned. I wasn't planning to. Good. Then Jimin turned and walked back into the apartment. The moment he stepped inside, the entire room fell silent. Minseo stood near the couch. She looked almost exactly the same as Jungkook remembered, tall, confident, elegant in a quiet way that always made people pay attention when she entered a room. Her eyes met Jimin instantly. Hi, she said. Jimin stopped a few steps away. His voice was calm but distant. Hi. The tension in the room became almost unbearable. Namjoon quietly stood up from the couch. I think we should give them some space, he said carefully. Hoseok immediately grabbed Taehyung's arm. Yes, Hoseok said dramatically, we respect emotional privacy. Taehyung whispered loudly, but we also want to hear everything. Namjoon dragged both of them toward the kitchen. Within seconds, the living room was empty except for Jimin and Minseo. From the balcony, Jungkook could see them through the window. He didn't mean to watch, but he couldn't look away. Inside the apartment, Jimin crossed his arms. You shouldn't have come here. Minseo nodded slightly. I know. Then why are you here? Minseo took a slow breath. I needed to see you. That's not a reason. It is for me. Jimin's expression hardened slightly. We ended things for a reason. I remember. Then respect that. Minseo's eyes flickered with something emotional. I tried, she said quietly. Jimin didn't respond. Silence stretched between them. Then Minseo spoke again. You look different. Jimin frowned slightly. What does that mean? You look happier. Jimin shrugged. It's my birthday. Minseo smiled faintly. You always pretended birthdays didn't matter. People change. Minseo's gaze drifted briefly toward the balcony window. She noticed Jungkook standing outside. Their eyes met for a brief second. Then she looked back at Jimin. Is that him? She asked softly. Jimin's expression sharpened. What? The one who wrote you a letter tonight. Jimin went completely still. Jungkook felt his stomach drop. How do you know about that? Jimin asked slowly. Minseo shrugged slightly. The walls here are thin. Jimin ran a hand through his hair in frustration. Unbelievable. Minseo tilted her head. You didn't answer my question. Jimin's voice grew colder. It's none of your business. Minseo studied him carefully. You care about him. Jimin didn't respond. But the silence itself was an answer. Minseo nodded slowly. I thought so. Jimin sighed. You didn't come here to analyze my love life. No, Minseo said quietly. I came because of something else. Jimin's patience was clearly thinning. Then say it. Minseo hesitated. For the first time since arriving, her confident posture wavered slightly. I made a mistake, she said. Jimin laughed once without humor. That's an understatement. Minseo didn't argue. I shouldn't have left the way I did. That was 2 years ago. I know. Jimin's eyes narrowed slightly. So why are you here now? Minseo looked directly at him. Because I realized something too late. Jimin crossed his arms again. What? Minseo's voice dropped. I still love you. The words hung in the room like a sudden explosion. On the balcony, Jungkook's breath caught. Inside the apartment, Jimin stared at her in disbelief. You can't be serious. I am. You broke up with me, Jimin said sharply. You walked away without even explaining why. I thought it was the right choice. And now suddenly you changed your mind. Yes. Jimin laughed again, louder this time. That's convenient. Minseo's eyes filled with frustration. I didn't come here to fight. Then you came to the wrong place. Jimin's voice was colder now. Minseo stepped closer. I saw you with him. Jimin didn't move. And he said. You looked at him the same way you used to look at me. Jimin's jaw tightened. That's not your concern anymore. Minseo's voice cracked slightly. But it still hurts. Jimin stared at her. You don't get to be hurt. Why not? Because you're the one who left. Minseo's eyes glistened now. I left because I thought you deserved better. Jimin's laugh this time was harsh. That's the worst excuse I've ever heard. Minseo shook her head. You don't understand. Then explain it. Minseo hesitated again. Then she said quietly. I was sick. Jimin froze. The anger in his expression faltered. What? Minseo's voice trembled slightly. I had a heart condition. Jimin stared at her. I didn't want you to stay with someone who might not survive surgery. The room went silent. Even from the balcony, Jungkook could feel the shock. Jimin took a slow step back. You're telling me you broke up with me because you thought you might die. Minseo nodded weakly. Yes. Jimin ran both hands through his hair. You idiot, he whispered. I know. You thought leaving without explanation would hurt less. I thought you'd move on. Jimin looked toward the balcony window for a brief moment. His eyes met Jungkook again. Something complicated flashed between them. Then Jimin looked back at Minseo. So what now? He asked quietly. Minseo swallowed. I survived the surgery. Jimin nodded slowly. I'm glad. But I realized something while recovering, she continued. Jimin waited. Minseo's voice softened. I realized the person I wanted beside me was still you. The room fell silent again. Jimin stood there for a long moment, absorbing the weight of everything she had said. Outside on the balcony, Jungkook felt the fragile hope from earlier begin to crack. Because suddenly the night wasn't just about a letter anymore. Now it was about the past, trying to reclaim the future. The room remained silent long after Minseo finished speaking. The faint music from the speaker had shifted to a slower song, something soft and nostalgic that now felt painfully inappropriate for the moment unfolding in the living room. Jimin stood perfectly still. For the first time since she arrived, the anger in his face had disappeared, but the calm that replaced it wasn't peaceful. It looked like someone standing in the middle of a storm trying to understand where the lightning would strike next. You were sick, Jimin said quietly. Minseo nodded. Yes. And instead of telling me, he continued slowly, you decided I should live with confusion and heartbreak. Minseo's eyes lowered. I thought it would protect you. Jimin let out a hollow laugh. That's the second time someone has used that excuse tonight. Minseo frowned slightly. What do you mean? Jimin didn't answer immediately. His gaze drifted toward the balcony window again. Yunguk was still there. Standing in the dim light outside, watching everything unfold like someone who had accidentally become part of a tragedy he never intended to join. Jimin looked away again. Minseo noticed the glance. That's him, isn't it? She said softly. Jimin's jaw tightened slightly. You don't get to talk about him. Minseo studied him carefully. You care about him. I already told you this conversation isn't about that. But it is, she said quietly. Jimin's patience snapped slightly. No, he said sharply. This conversation is about the fact that you disappeared from my life for 2 years without explanation. Minseo flinched. You're right. You didn't answer my calls. I couldn't. You blocked my messages. I thought it would help you move on. You erased me, Jimin said, his voice tightening. Minseo's eyes filled with regret. I thought if you hated me, it would be easier. Jimin shook his head slowly. That's not love, he said. Minseo's voice trembled. Maybe not, but it was fear. Jimin turned away, packing slowly across the room. In the kitchen, the others were pretending not to listen. Taehyung was holding a glass of water but hadn't taken a sip in 5 minutes. Hoseok leaned halfway through the doorway like someone watching a live drama. Namjoon kept whispering, we should not be listening to this, but he wasn't moving away either. Back in the living room, Jimin stopped walking. You came here tonight, he said quietly. Yes. On my birthday. Yes. To tell me you still love me. Minseo nodded. Yes. Jimin turned slowly. His expression was calm again, but something in his eyes had become sharper. And what exactly do you expect me to do with that information? Minseo hesitated. I wanted you to know the truth. Jimin almost smiled. That sounds familiar. Minseo frowned. What does? Jimin reached into his pocket and pulled out the folded letter again. Minseo looked at it. The letter he gave you, she said softly. Yes. Jimin looked at the paper for a moment before speaking again. You know what's strange, he said. Minseo waited. This letter contains the most honest thing anyone has said to me in 2 years. Minseo swallowed. And you came tonight with another truth. Yes. Jimin looked up. So now I'm standing here with 2 people who decided to confess their feelings on the same night. Minseo blinked in surprise. What? Jimin didn't explain further. But from the balcony, Jungkook felt his heart slam against his ribs. Minseo slowly turned her head toward the window again. This time she looked directly at Jungkook. Their eyes met across the glass. The air between them felt tense and complicated. Minseok turned back to Jimin. You care about him, she said quietly. Jimin didn't deny it. Minseok nodded slowly, absorbing the truth. That explains the way you looked at him earlier. Jimin crossed his arms again. You're very observant for someone who disappeared for 2 years. Minseok didn't react to the sharpness in his voice. Instead she asked softly, do you love him? The question fell heavily into the room. Jimin froze. Even the people in the kitchen stopped breathing. Outside on the balcony, Jungkook felt the world tilt slightly. Jimin didn't answer immediately. His gaze dropped to the letter in his hand. Then slowly he said, I don't know yet. Minseok studied his face carefully. But you might. Jimin didn't respond. Minseok took a small step closer. Jimin, she said quietly, I know I hurt you. That's an understatement. But I also know something about you that most people don't. Jimin frowned slightly. What is that? Minseok's voice softened. You don't let people into your heart easily. Jimin looked away. But when you do, she continued, you love them completely. Silence stretched between them. And you love me like that, she said. Jimin didn't deny it. Minseok took a slow breath. So the real question isn't whether you care about him. Jimin's expression tightened. It's whether you're ready to love someone like that again. The words hit harder than she expected. Jimin stood still for a long moment. Then he laughed quietly. You came all the way here to give me emotional analysis. No. Then why are you really here? Minseok hesitated. Her eyes flickered with something vulnerable. I wanted to know if there was still a place for me in your life. The room went completely still. Jimin stared at her. You're asking if I would take you back. Minseok didn't answer directly. But the silence said everything. From the balcony, Jungkook felt his chest tighten painfully. For a moment he wondered if he should leave. Maybe this conversation wasn't meant for him to witness. Maybe the letter had been a mistake. Inside the living room, Jimin walked slowly toward the window. Jungkook immediately straightened. Jimin stopped only a few feet away from the glass separating them. Their eyes met again. For a moment neither spoke. Then Jimin opened the balcony door. The cool night air rushed inside. Come in, Jimin said quietly. Jungkook blinked. What? You've been standing out here long enough. Jungkook hesitated. I don't think this conversation involves me. Jimin tilted his head slightly. Oh, it absolutely does. Jungkook stepped inside slowly. The tension in the room became almost unbearable. Minseok studied him carefully now. Up close. Jungkook shifted slightly under her gaze. Jimin closed the balcony door behind him. Then he stepped between them. Since tonight is apparently the night of brutal honesty, Jimin said calmly, we might as well finish the conversation properly. Minseok looked confused. What do you mean? Jimin glanced at Jungkook. Then back at Minseok. You asked if I still had a place for you in my life. Yes. Jimin nodded slowly. And he, Jimin said, gesturing slightly toward Jungkook, just confessed that he's been in love with me for 2 years. Minseok's eyes widened slightly. Jungkook looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him. The room felt heavy with expectation. Jimin took a slow breath. Then he said something that shocked both of them. I'm tired of people deciding things for me. Minseok frowned. What? Jimin's voice grew firmer. You left me because you thought it would protect me. Minseok lowered her gaze. And Jungkook hid his feelings because he thought it would protect me too. Jungkook stiffened slightly. Jimin shook his head. I'm done with that. Minseok looked up again. What are you saying? Jimin's eyes moved between them. I'm saying tonight isn't about choosing between the past and the future. Jungkook frowned slightly. Then what is it about? Jimin's voice softened. It's about figuring out what I actually feel. The honesty in his tone made the room fall silent again. Minseok looked at him carefully. And how do you plan to do that? Jimin glanced at Jungkook. Then back at her. With time. Minseok's expression tightened slightly. And what if I don't want to wait? Jimin's eyes sharpened. Then you shouldn't have left 2 years ago. The words hit hard. Minseok flinched. Jungkook remained completely still. Jimin's gaze softened slightly as he continued. I'm not the same person you left, he said quietly. Mincio nodded. I can see that. Jimin looked briefly at Jungkook again. And neither is my heart. The air felt heavy with emotion. Mincio exhaled slowly. So you're not rejecting me. Jimin shook his head. But you're not accepting me either. No. Mincio gave a faint sad smile. That's fair. Then she turned toward Jungkook. For a moment the two of them simply looked at each other. You're brave, she said quietly. Jungkook blinked in surprise. Why? You told him the truth. Jungkook glanced briefly at Jimin. Eventually. Mincio nodded. Don't waste that courage. Jungkook didn't know how to respond. Mincio looked back at Jimin one last time. I won't disappear again, she said softly. Jimin didn't reply. But he didn't tell her to leave either. And standing there between the past that had returned and the future that had just confessed itself, Jimin realized something terrifying. His heart was no longer the same. And whichever direction he chose next would change all of their lives. For a few seconds after Mincio's final words, the room felt frozen in time. The air inside the apartment had grown heavy, thick with the kind of tension that made even breathing feel loud. The music from the speaker had stopped sometime during the argument, leaving only the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of cars passing outside. Jimin stood between them. Between the past that had returned unexpectedly and the future that had confessed itself without warning. Mincio looked calm on the surface, but her fingers were tightly clasped together, the only sign that she was fighting to control her emotions. Jungkook stood near the balcony door, unsure where to put his hands, unsure if he should stay or leave. From the kitchen doorway, Taehyung whispered loudly, "This is the most intense birthday party we've ever had." Hosak elbowed him. "Stop narrating the tragedy." Namjoon sighed deeply. "We should not be witnesses to this." None of them moved. Back in the living room, Mincio looked at Jimin again. "So what happens now?" she asked quietly. Jimin didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked slowly to the couch and sat down. The movement surprised both of them. Jimin leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees, hands loosely clasped. "I need to understand something first," he said calmly. Mincio nodded. "What? You said you had surgery." "Yes." "And you survived." "Yes." Jimin's eyes lifted to meet hers. "So why didn't you come back sooner?" The question hit harder than she expected. Mincio hesitated. Jungkook noticed the pause immediately. Jimin did too. "Mincio," Jimin said quietly, "answer the question." Mincio took a slow breath. "Because I was ashamed." Jimin frowned. "Ashamed of what?" "Of leaving you the way I did." Jimin's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. "That didn't stop you tonight." Mincio looked down briefly. "No." "Then what changed?" Mincio looked toward Jungkook. That small movement didn't go unnoticed. Jungkook felt a strange uneasiness crawl through his chest. Jimin's eyes narrowed slightly. "Explain," he said. Mincio hesitated again. Then she said something none of them expected. "I saw you two together last week." Jungkook blinked. "What?" Jimin looked confused. "Where?" "At the cafe near the studio," Mincio said softly. Jimin's memory flashed instantly. The quiet afternoon, the coffee cups, Jungkook laughing at something stupid Jimin had said. Mincio continued. "You didn't see me," she said. Jimin leaned back slowly. "You were watching us." "Yes." Jungkook shifted uncomfortably. "That's a little creepy." Mincio didn't deny it. "I wasn't planning to approach you," she said, "but then I saw the way you looked at him." Jimin's gaze sharpened. "And what did you see?" Mincio's voice softened. "The same look you used to give me." The room went silent again. Jungkook felt his face grow warm. "That's not," he started then stopped. Jimin didn't look away from Mincio. "So seeing me smile with someone else made you come back?" Mincio nodded slowly. "Yes." Jimin laughed quietly. But this time there was something dangerous in the sound. "That's not love." Mincio flinched. "That's jealousy." Mincio's voice trembled slightly. "Maybe." Jimin stood up again. His patience was clearly running thin now. You left me when things were difficult, he said, then you came back the moment you saw me moving forward. Mincio shook her head quickly. It wasn't like that. Then explain it better. Mincio looked desperate now. I realized I still had feelings. After 2 years. Yes. After seeing me with someone else. Mincio's voice cracked. Yes. Jimin's silence became heavy. Jungkook stood there feeling strangely guilty, even though he hadn't done anything. From the kitchen, Taehyung whispered again. This is brutal. Hosak nodded slowly. I feel like we're watching a courtroom drama. Namjoon rubbed his face. This is none of our business. Yet none of them left. Back in the living room, Jimin looked exhausted now. Mincio, he said quietly, do you know what the hardest part was when you left? Mincio looked up. What? The silence. Her expression crumbled slightly. I know. No, Jimin said softly, you don't. His voice wasn't angry anymore. That somehow made it worse. I spent months wondering what I did wrong, he continued. Mincio's eyes filled with tears. You didn't do anything wrong. But I didn't know that. The room felt painfully quiet. Jimin looked down briefly before continuing. I thought maybe I wasn't enough. Mincio shook her head quickly. You were everything. Then why didn't you trust me enough to stay? Mincio had no answer. Jimin looked at Jungkook then. It was a brief glance, but it carried weight. Do you know what Jungkook did tonight? Jimin said softly. Mincio looked confused. He told me the truth, Jimin said. Jungkook froze slightly. Jimin continued. He was terrified, he thought I might reject him. Jungkook looked embarrassed. But he still told me. Mincio lowered her gaze. Jimin's voice softened again. That kind of honesty matters. Mincio whispered. I know. Jimin studied her carefully. And that's why I can't just pretend the past didn't happen. Mincio nodded slowly. I understand. Jungkook finally spoke. His voice was hesitant. Maybe I should leave. Both of them turned toward him instantly. No, Jimin said. Jungkook blinked. Why not? Jimin crossed his arms again. Because you're part of this now. Jungkook sighed. I didn't want to be part of a love triangle. Taehyung's voice suddenly echoed from the kitchen. Technically, it's more like emotional chaos geometry. Taehyung Namjoon groaned. Jimin rubbed his temples. Can you three stop commentating? Hosak leaned out of the kitchen. We're emotionally invested now. Jimin glared at them. They disappeared again immediately. The tension returned. Mincio wiped her eyes quietly. So what do you want me to do? She asked Jimin. Jimin looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something unexpected. I want you to be honest. I am being honest. Completely honest. Mincio nodded. I will be. Jimin's voice became serious again. Then answer this. Mincio waited. If you hadn't seen me with Jungkook last week, would you still have come back tonight? The question struck like lightning. Mincio opened her mouth. Then closed it again. The hesitation was enough. Jimin nodded slowly. I thought so. Mincio whispered desperately. But I'm here now. Yes, Jimin said quietly. And that matters. Her eyes filled with fragile hope. Jimin continued. But it doesn't erase the past. The hope dimmed slightly. Jungkook watched silently, unsure what to feel anymore. Finally, Jimin looked between them both. This night started with a letter, he said softly. Jungkook glanced at the folded paper still in Jimin's hand. And somehow it turned into the most complicated birthday of my life. Taehyung whispered again from the kitchen. Best party ever. Hosak whispered back. I need popcorn. Namjoon sighed deeply. Jimin ignored them. He looked at Jungkook. Are you still scared? He asked quietly. Jungkook hesitated. Yes. Of what? Of losing you. Jimin held his gaze. You're not losing me tonight. The simple sentence made Jungkook's chest tighten. Mincio watched the exchange silently. For the first time since arriving, she seemed to truly understand something. This wasn't the same Jimin she had left behind. And the boy standing near the balcony wasn't just a random confession. He had already become part of Jimin's world. Mincio took a slow breath. Then I guess the real question, she said softly, is who you'll choose in the end. Jimin shook his head immediately. That's not the question. Both of them looked at him. Jimin's voice became quiet but firm. The real question, he said, is whether my heart still belongs to the past or if it's ready for something new. The words hung in the room like the final line of a confession. And for the first time since the letter was opened, all three of them realized something undeniable. The night had changed everything. The silence after Jimin's words stretched longer than anyone expected. The apartment felt smaller somehow, as if the walls themselves were listening. Outside, the city lights flickered through the window like distant stars. Inside, three hearts stood at the edge of a decision none of them had prepared for. Jimin remained standing in the middle of the room. The folded letter was still in his hand. It had started everything. A simple confession written in careful handwriting. Now it felt heavier than paper. Mincio watched him quietly. Her expression was no longer defensive or desperate. Instead, it carried something calmer now, an understanding that this moment was no longer about convincing him. Jungkook stood near the balcony door, his chest rising and falling slowly as he tried to keep his emotions under control. He had never imagined things would go this far. He had only planned to give a letter. Not to stand inside a living room where someone from Jimin's past had returned to claim a future. Jimin finally exhaled slowly. You're both waiting for an answer, he said. Neither of them spoke. But the truth of it was obvious. Jimin ran a hand through his hair. This night is ridiculous, he muttered. From the kitchen doorway, Taehyung whispered loudly, the tension is incredible. Namjoon immediately pulled him back again. Stop provoking destiny. Hosok whispered, but destiny is very entertaining tonight. Jimin ignored them again. His eyes moved first toward Mincio. For a moment something old flickered there. Memories. Shared laughter. The warmth of a relationship that once felt permanent. Mincio saw it too. Her voice softened. You don't have to rush this, she said quietly. Jimin looked at her. I know. You can take time. I know. Mincio stepped a little closer. But I need you to know something before you decide. Jimin raised an eyebrow slightly. What? Mincio's voice trembled just slightly now. I didn't come back tonight to compete with him. Jungkook shifted awkwardly at the word. Mincio continued. I came back because I still love you. Jimin didn't interrupt. But love, she said softly, isn't something you can demand from someone. Her eyes dropped briefly. If your heart isn't with me anymore, I won't force it. The honesty in her voice made the room feel heavier. Jungkook glanced at Jimin. He could see the conflict clearly now. This wasn't simple. Love rarely was. Jimin spoke again after a moment. You hurt me, he said quietly. Mincio nodded immediately. I know. And part of me still remembers how much. I understand. Jimin looked down briefly at the letter. But something changed tonight. Mincio waited. Jimin looked toward Jungkook now. And the atmosphere shifted instantly. Jungkook straightened slightly. He looked like someone standing on the edge of a cliff. Jimin walked slowly toward him. The distance between them disappeared one step at a time. When Jimin stopped, they were only a few feet apart. You said earlier you were scared, Jimin said softly. Jungkook nodded. Yes. Are you still scared now? Jungkook let out a quiet breath. Yes. Jimin tilted his head slightly. Why? Jungkook hesitated. Then he answered honestly. Because I think I might lose this before it even begins. Jimin studied him carefully. That's a very dramatic sentence. Jungkook gave a weak smile. I learned from the best. Jimin laughed quietly. The tension eased slightly in the room. Then Jimin asked something unexpected. Why me? Jungkook blinked. You already asked that earlier. I'm asking again. Jungkook rubbed the back of his neck, searching for the right words. Because when I'm around you, he said slowly, I feel like the version of myself I actually want to be. Jimin's expression softened slightly. Jungkook continued. You see people in a way most others don't. Jimin listened quietly. You notice when someone is tired even when they're smiling. You remember the small things everyone else forgets. Jungkook looked directly at him now. And when you look at someone, you make them feel like they matter. The words landed gently but deeply. Jimin didn't speak for a moment. Minseo watched them both. There was no jealousy in her expression now. Just recognition. Jimin finally spoke again. "You're very sincere," he said quietly. Jungkook shrugged awkwardly. "I'm terrible at lying." "That's true." Jimin looked at the letter again. "You carried this for 3 months." "Yes." "Why didn't you give it to me sooner?" Jungkook hesitated. "Because I didn't want to ruin what we had." Jimin's voice softened. "And now?" Jungkook smiled faintly. "Now I already ruined it." Jimin shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "You didn't." Jungkook looked surprised. Minseo watched silently. Jimin took a slow breath. "2 years ago," he said quietly, "someone I loved disappeared without giving me the truth." Minseo lowered her gaze again. Jimin continued. "Tonight someone else risked everything just to be honest with me." The room felt very still. Jimin turned back toward Minseo. Their eyes met. "I loved you," he said gently. Minseo's eyes filled with tears. "I know. And part of me probably always will." A tear slipped down her cheek. "But the person I am now," Jimin continued softly, "isn't the same person you left behind." Minseo nodded. "I can see that." Jimin stepped closer to her. His voice carried kindness but also finality. "You didn't lose me because you got sick." Minseo looked at him. "You lost me because you didn't trust me enough to stay." The truth hit hard. But Minseo didn't argue. She simply nodded slowly. "You're right." The room felt painfully quiet. Then Jimin did something unexpected. He gently took her hand. The gesture made everyone freeze. But his voice remained calm. "You deserve someone who won't remind you of regret every time you look at them." Minseo's tears fell silently now. "And I deserve someone who chooses to stay." Her fingers tightened slightly around his. Then slowly she let go. "I hope he does that," she said softly, glancing briefly toward Jungkook. Jungkook looked startled. Minseo wiped her tears and gave a small, tired smile. "Take care of him," she said quietly. Jungkook nodded. "I will." Minseo looked at Jimin one last time. "Happy birthday." Then she turned and walked toward the door. For a moment no one moved. When the door closed behind her, the apartment felt strangely empty. Taehyung slowly emerged from the kitchen. "Wow," he whispered. Hosok wiped imaginary tears. "That was emotionally devastating." Namjoon sighed deeply. "I feel like we just watched the ending of a film." Jimin turned toward Jungkook again. Now the room was quieter. The chaos had faded. Only the two of them remained in the center of the moment that had started with a letter. Jungkook shifted nervously. "So what happens now?" Jimin looked at him for a long second. Then he held up the letter again. "This," he said softly, "was the most dangerous gift anyone has ever given me." Jungkook smiled nervously. "You said that earlier." Jimin stepped closer. "Yes." Their eyes met again. "But now I finally understand why." Jungkook's heartbeat began racing. "Why?" Jimin's voice lowered slightly. "Because once you read something like this, your heart can't go back to what it was before." The room felt quiet. Warm. Different. Jimin reached forward and gently took Jungkook's hand. The simple touch made Jungkook's breath catch. 3 months, Jimin said softly. Jungkook nodded. "Yes." Jimin smiled faintly. "You should have given it to me sooner." Jungkook laughed quietly. "I was terrified." Jimin's grip on his hand tightened slightly. "You don't have to be anymore." Jungkook looked at him carefully. "Does that mean?" Jimin interrupted softly. "It means my heart isn't living in the past anymore." Jungkook felt warmth spread through his chest. "And the future?" he asked. Jimin smiled. "That depends on whether you're brave enough to stay." Jungkook didn't hesitate. "I stayed for 2 years already." Jimin laughed softly. Then he said the words that finally answered everything. "Then stay with me a little longer." And in the quiet living room where a birthday party had turned into something far more life-changing, the letter that once carried a secret had become the beginning of something real. The apartment did not return to normal after Mincio left. Something in the air had shifted too deeply for that. The front door closed behind her with a soft click that echoed through the living room like the end of a long chapter. For a moment no one spoke. Even Taehyung, who usually filled silence with jokes, remained unusually quiet. Jimin was still standing in the center of the room. Jungkook's hand was still in his. Neither of them had noticed they were still holding on. Hosak finally broke the silence. "Well," he said slowly, rubbing his hands together like someone finishing an intense movie. "That was emotionally catastrophic." Taehyung nodded with wide eyes. "I feel like I aged 5 years watching that." Namjoon sighed deeply. This birthday party has turned into a life-changing event. Jimin glanced at them. "Are you three done being spectators?" Taehyung pointed at him immediately. "We were not spectators, we were emotionally supportive background characters." Yunguk laughed quietly under his breath. The sound surprised Jimin. He looked down. Only then did he realize they were still holding hands. For a second neither of them moved. Jungkook felt warmth spread across his face. Should we?" he started awkwardly. Jimin raised an eyebrow. "Should we what?" "Stop holding hands in front of an audience." Taehyung gasped dramatically. "Don't stop, the story just got good." Hosak grabbed a pillow and hugged it like someone watching their favorite drama. Namjoon pinched the bridge of his nose. "I regret inviting everyone." Jimin rolled his eyes and finally released Jungkook's hand. But the warmth lingered. Jungkook rubbed the back of his neck nervously. "That was intense." "You think?" Jimin replied dryly. Taehyung stepped closer now, eyes sparkling with curiosity. "So," he said slowly, "are you two officially something now?" Jimin turned toward him. "Why do you sound like a reporter asking for confirmation?" "Because I need clarity for emotional reasons." Hosak nodded seriously. "Yes, our hearts deserve closure." Jungkook looked like he wanted to disappear again. Jimin crossed his arms. "You're both insufferable." Namjoon finally spoke again. "I think what they're asking," he said calmly, "is what happens next." Jimin looked toward Jungkook. Jungkook immediately looked away. "Don't ask me," Jungkook muttered. "My plan ended after the letter." Taehyung laughed loudly. "Your master plan was a piece of paper." "It was a heartfelt piece of paper," Jungkook protested weakly. Jimin watched him quietly. There was something soft in his eyes now that hadn't been there earlier in the night. "You were shaking when you gave it to me," Jimin said. Jungkook groaned. "Please don't remind me." "It was adorable," Taehyung said instantly. "Taehyung," Jungkook warned. Hosak leaned closer. "You confessed during cake cutting," he said with admiration. "That's bold." "That was not the plan," Jungkook said quickly. Jimin tilted his head. "So you had a plan?" Jungkook sighed. "Yes." "Tell me." "I was supposed to give you the letter privately." Taehyung snorted. "Romantic." "But then everyone started yelling about cake," Jungkook continued, "and suddenly the moment just happened." Jimin smiled faintly. "So you panicked?" "Yes." "You looked like someone facing execution." "Because I thought I was." The room filled with soft laughter again. But underneath the humor, something else lingered. Something fragile. Something new. Namjoon studied them quietly. "You two should probably talk alone," he said finally. Jimin glanced at him. "We've been talking all night." Namjoon shook his head. "No, you've been surviving emotional chaos." Taehyung nodded seriously. "He's right. This requires a second conversation." Hosak pointed dramatically toward the hallway. "Go process your feelings." Jungkook raised his hands. "Why does it sound like you're sending us into a therapy session?" "Because we are," Taehyung replied. Jimin sighed but didn't argue. Instead he looked at Jungkook. "Walk with me." Jungkook blinked. "Where?" "Just outside." Jungkook hesitated. Then he nodded. "Okay." They slipped out of the apartment again, leaving the others whispering behind them. The hallway outside was quiet and dimly lit. For a moment they simply stood there. Neither of them knew how to start the conversation. Jungkook finally spoke first. "So that was your ex?" Jimin leaned against the wall. "Yes." Jungkook looked down at the floor. You loved her a lot. Yes. Jungkook nodded slowly. I could tell. Jimin studied him carefully. Does that bother you? Jungkook shrugged. A little. Jimin raised an eyebrow. Why? Because she's part of your story. And Jungkook looked up. I'm not sure where I fit in that story yet. Jimin's expression softened slightly. You're here tonight. That doesn't mean I'll be here tomorrow. Jimin stepped closer. Do you want to be? Jungkook didn't hesitate. Yes. Jimin watched him carefully. You're very honest. You said you liked honesty. I do. Jungkook exhaled slowly. But honesty also means admitting something else. Jimin tilted his head. What? Jungkook hesitated. Then he said quietly. I was really scared when she said she still loved you. Jimin didn't look surprised. I figured. Jungkook laughed nervously. Part of me thought you might run after her. Jimin shook his head slowly. Why would I? Because she's your past. Jimin's voice softened. And you're my present. Jungkook blinked. The words landed heavier than he expected. Jimin continued. You didn't just confess tonight, he said, you reminded me what honesty feels like. Jungkook leaned back against the opposite wall. That sounds like a lot of pressure. It's not pressure. What is it then? Jimin thought for a moment. Possibility. Jungkook smiled faintly. I like that word. Jimin studied him again. You really waited 2 years. Jungkook nodded. Yes. That's ridiculous. I know. You could have dated someone else. I tried. Jimin looked surprised. You tried. Jungkook nodded awkwardly. Once. And Jungkook scratched the back of his neck. I accidentally called her Jimin. Jimin burst out laughing. You're kidding. I wish I was. That's terrible. She didn't think it was funny. Jimin was still laughing. You're unbelievable. Jungkook shrugged. Apparently I'm loyal to a fault. The laughter faded slowly. The silence that followed felt warmer now. More comfortable. Jimin finally said something that surprised even himself. You know, he said softly, when I read your letter earlier, my heart really did change. Jungkook looked at him carefully. In a good way. Jimin nodded slowly. Yes. Jungkook's shoulders relaxed slightly. I'm glad. Jimin leaned his head back against the wall. This night was chaotic, he said, but maybe it needed to happen. Jungkook frowned slightly. What do you mean? I needed to face the past, Jimin said quietly. And now? Jimin looked at him. Now I want to see what the future looks like. Jungkook felt his chest tighten. With me? Jimin smiled faintly. That depends. Jungkook groaned. Why do you keep making everything sound mysterious? Jimin stepped closer again. Because I like watching you panic. I'm not panicking. You absolutely are. Jungkook tried to argue but couldn't. Jimin laughed softly. Then his voice became gentler. Relax, he said, I'm not going anywhere. Jungkook studied his face carefully. You're serious? Yes. Jungkook took a slow breath. Good. Jimin tilted his head. Why good? Because I waited a long time for this moment. Jimin smiled. Well, don't waste it. Jungkook looked confused. Wasted how? Jimin leaned a little closer. By overthinking everything. Jungkook laughed quietly. That's my specialty. Jimin's voice softened. Then let me make it simple. Jungkook waited. Jimin held his gaze and said the words that finally changed the direction of the night. I want to see where this goes. Jungkook's heart raced. That sounds promising. It is. Jungkook smiled slowly. Then I guess the real story starts now. Jimin nodded. Yes. And for the first time since the letter had been opened in the middle of a birthday celebration, the tension of the night finally began to transform into something else. Not chaos. Not confusion. But the quiet, uncertain beginning of something neither of them had expected, and both of them were finally ready to explore. The hallway outside the apartment was quiet, but the silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. It carried something warmer now. Something uncertain but hopeful. Jungkook leaned back against the wall, arms folded loosely across his chest as he watched Jimin carefully. The dim ceiling light cast soft shadows across Jimin's face, making his expression harder to read. For the first time that night, the chaos had paused. No ex-girlfriend. No shocked friends whispering from the kitchen. No emotional explosions. Just the two of them. Jimin broke the silence first. "You're thinking too much again." Jungkook blinked. "What makes you think that?" "You're staring at the floor like it personally offended you." Jungkook laughed quietly. "I'm processing." "That's a dangerous activity for you." "Why?" "Because you overthink everything until it becomes a tragedy." Jungkook pushed himself off the wall. "That's unfair." Jimin tilted his head. "You wrote a 3-month confession letter instead of saying 3 words." Jungkook sighed. "Okay, maybe I overthink a little." Jimin smiled faintly. "Just a little." They both laughed softly. But the laughter faded again into a quieter moment. Jungkook looked at Jimin more seriously now. "Can I ask something?" Jimin crossed his arms. "You've been asking things all night. This one is different." Jimin studied his expression. "All right." Jungkook hesitated. Then he asked the question that had been sitting in his chest for hours. "When she said she still loved you, did it change anything?" Jimin didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned his shoulder against the wall and looked down the empty hallway. The question was simple. The answer was, "Of course it changed something," Jimin said finally. Jungkook felt a small knot tighten in his stomach. "What changed?" Jimin looked back at him. "It reminded me how serious love can be." Jungkook nodded slowly. "That sounds complicated." "It is." Jimin rubbed the back of his neck. "When someone says they love you, it carries weight." Jungkook's voice became quieter. "Even if it's from the past." Jimin nodded. "Yes." Jungkook looked down briefly. "Right." Jimin noticed the subtle shift in his mood. "You're worried again." "I'm not worried." "That's a lie." Jungkook sighed. "Fine, maybe a little." Jimin stepped closer. "Why?" Jungkook looked up. "Because I don't want to be the reason you rushed into something." Jimin frowned slightly. "You think this is rushing?" "A little." Jimin laughed softly. "Jungkook, you waited 2 years." "That's true. If anything, we're extremely late." Jungkook smiled slightly at that. But the nervous energy hadn't fully disappeared. Jimin noticed. "You're still holding back," he said. Jungkook shrugged. "I don't want to mess this up." "You already messed it up." Jungkook looked horrified. "What?" Jimin grinned. "You confessed during cake cutting in front of everyone." Jungkook groaned loudly. "Please stop bringing that up." It was dramatic. It was embarrassing. It was honest. That word lingered between them again. Jungkook looked at him carefully. "You really liked the letter." Jimin held it up again. The paper had become slightly wrinkled from being held so many times tonight. "It changed something," he said quietly. Jungkook's voice softened. "I'm glad I didn't throw it away." Jimin looked at him curiously. "You almost did." "Yes." "Why?" Jungkook hesitated. Then he admitted something he hadn't said before. "Because I thought you might laugh." Jimin blinked. "Laugh?" "Yeah." Jungkook looked down again. "I thought you'd think it was stupid." Jimin's voice softened immediately. "Jungkook." Jungkook looked up. "I would never laugh at something like that." The sincerity in his voice made Jungkook's chest tighten. "You say that now," Jungkook muttered. "I would have said it then too." Jungkook studied his face. "You're serious?" "Yes." Jungkook exhaled slowly. "That makes me feel a little less stupid." Jimin stepped closer again. "You were never stupid." Jungkook laughed quietly. "I called someone else by your name on a date." Jimin tried not to laugh but failed. "Okay, that part was stupid." Jungkook pointed at him. "Hey." Jimin smiled. "But it was also honest." Jungkook shook his head. "You really like that word." "I do." Jungkook tilted his head. "Why?" Jimin thought for a moment. "Because honesty is rare." Jungkook nodded slowly. "That's true." Then his voice grew quieter again. Can I be honest about something else? Jimin looked curious. Go ahead. Jungkook hesitated for a long second. Then he said softly. When she was standing there, I felt like I was intruding on something important. Jimin frowned slightly. You were. It felt like I was. Why? Because she was part of your life before I was. Jimin looked at him carefully. That doesn't make you less important. Jungkook shrugged. Maybe. Jimin stepped even closer now. Close enough that the distance between them almost disappeared. Jungkook. Yes. You need to stop measuring yourself against the past. Jungkook looked uncertain. That's easier said than done. Then listen carefully. Jungkook waited. Jimin's voice became soft but firm. I didn't choose the past tonight. Jungkook's heart skipped. I know. No, Jimin said, you heard asterisk it, but I'm not sure you believe it yet. Jungkook didn't answer. Jimin studied him for a moment. Then he did something unexpected. He reached forward and lightly grabbed the front of Jungkook's hoodie. Jungkook's eyes widened. Jimin. You're overthinking again. Jungkook's voice went slightly higher. Maybe because you're holding my hoodie like we're in a dramatic movie. Jimin smirked. Maybe we are. Jungkook laughed nervously. You're enjoying this way too much. A little. The hallway felt smaller now. Warmer. Jimin's grip loosened slightly, but he didn't step away. Instead, he said something that made Jungkook's heart pound harder than anything earlier that night. You know what the most dangerous part of your letter was? Jungkook swallowed. What? Jimin leaned closer. Not the confession. Then what? The way it made me realize something. Jungkook barely breathed. What did you realize? Jimin's voice dropped almost to a whisper. That maybe I've been looking at you differently for longer than I wanted to admit. Jungkook's brain froze. What? Jimin laughed quietly at his stunned expression. You're cute when you're shocked. You just said something insane. Did I? You basically said you might have liked me before the letter. Jimin shrugged slightly. Maybe. Jungkook stared at him. How long? Jimin smiled mysteriously. That's classified information. Jungkook groaned. You're impossible. Jimin's voice softened again. But the letter forced me to face it. Jungkook's chest felt tight again. In a good way. Jimin nodded. Yes. Jungkook let out a long breath. Okay. Jimin raised an eyebrow. Okay. Yeah. That's your reaction. Jungkook smiled nervously. I'm trying not to faint. Jimin laughed. Then the laughter faded again into something quieter. More serious. Jungkook looked at him carefully. Can I ask one last question? You've asked about 50. This is the important one. Jimin waited. Jungkook's voice dropped slightly. When you held my hand earlier, was that just part of the emotional chaos? Jimin didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked down at Jungkook's hands. Then he slowly reached out again. And took one of them. Jungkook froze. Jimin's fingers tightened gently. No, he said softly. Jungkook's heart slammed in his chest. Then what was it? Jimin looked directly into his eyes. It was the moment I realized your letter wasn't just dangerous. Jungkook waited. It was also the beginning of something I didn't expect to want. The hallway felt completely silent. Jungkook's voice came out almost as a whisper. And what do you want now? Jimin smiled faintly. Right now? Yes. Jimin squeezed his hand slightly. I want to stop talking. Jungkook blinked. What? Jimin's eyes softened. You've talked enough tonight. And what happens instead? Jimin stepped closer. Close enough that the space between them disappeared completely. And in a quiet hallway outside a birthday party that had changed everything, Jungkook finally understood what Jimin meant when he said the letter was dangerous. Because some confessions didn't just reveal feelings. They changed the direction of two hearts forever. For a moment, neither of them moved. The hallway was quiet except for the faint noise of laughter coming from inside the apartment. Taehyung's voice echoed somewhere behind the door, followed by Hoseok yelling something about cake being eaten without permission. But the world outside that hallway felt distant. Jungkook could feel Jimin's hand still holding his. Warm. Real. And suddenly everything that had happened that night, the letter, the confession, Minseo's return, the arguments, the emotions, felt like a storm that had slowly cleared. What do you mean you want to stop talking? Jungkook asked quietly. Jimin smiled a little. You talk too much when you're nervous. That's because you keep saying mysterious things. Jimin laughed softly. You like mysteries. I like answers more. Jimin tilted his head slightly. All right, he said, then I'll give you an answer. Jungkook's heartbeat picked up again. Jimin slowly lifted the letter that was still in his hand. This, he said softly, looking at the folded paper, is the strangest birthday gift I've ever received. Jungkook rubbed the back of his neck. I thought about getting you shoes. Jimin looked at him. You replaced shoes with an emotional confession. I regret nothing. Jimin laughed again, the sound warm and genuine. The tension that had filled the night was gone now. In its place was something quieter. Something steady. Jimin looked at the letter again. When I opened this earlier, he said slowly, I thought it would complicate everything. Jungkook raised an eyebrow. It definitely did. Yes, Jimin admitted, but it also did something else. Jungkook waited. It made me realize how much I had been ignoring. Jungkook frowned slightly. Ignoring what? Jimin looked up at him. You. Jungkook blinked. What? Jimin leaned back against the wall again, thinking carefully before continuing. You've been beside me for years, he said, laughing at my jokes, staying up late talking about stupid things, showing up when I needed someone. Jungkook smiled faintly. That's what friends do. Yes, Jimin said softly, but not everyone writes a letter like that. Jungkook looked down. I didn't expect anything from it. I know. Jimin folded the letter carefully again and slipped it into his pocket. But it changed something inside me. Jungkook's voice softened. In a good way. Jimin nodded. Yes. For a few seconds they simply stood there. The hallway light hummed softly above them. Jungkook finally laughed quietly. You know, he said, this is the most dramatic birthday I've ever been part of. Jimin smiled. It's definitely the most dramatic one I've had. Your ex returned. Yes. You emotionally destroyed each other. More or less. And somehow I'm still here. Jimin looked at him warmly. Yes, he said. You are. Jungkook studied his face. Are you sure that's what you want? Jimin didn't hesitate this time. Yes. The certainty in his voice felt calm and solid. Not rushed. Not confused. Just real. Jungkook exhaled slowly. Good, he said quietly. Jimin raised an eyebrow. That's your reaction again. I'm trying to stay cool. You're failing. I know. They both laughed again. Inside the apartment, the door suddenly swung open. Taehyung leaned into the hallway dramatically. Are you two done having your romantic emotional resolution? Jungkook groaned. You were listening again. Taehyung ignored him. Hoseok appeared behind him holding a fork. We finished the cake. Jimin stared at them. You finished the cake. Namjoon's voice came from somewhere behind them. I tried to stop them. Taehyung pointed at Jimin and Jungkook suspiciously. So what's the final verdict? Jungkook covered his face. Why does this feel like a press conference? Hoseok grinned. Because we deserve answers. Jimin sighed but smiled slightly. You two are impossible. Taehyung crossed his arms dramatically. Just tell us one thing. What? Is the letter officially the best birthday gift ever? Jimin glanced at Jungkook. Jungkook looked nervous again. Jimin thought about everything that had happened that night. The fear in Jungkook's eyes when he handed over the envelope. The silence when he read the confession. The past that had returned. The choice he had made. Then Jimin smiled. Yes, he said softly. It is. Taehyung clapped loudly. I knew it. Hoseok threw his hands in the air. Romance wins. Namjoon shook his head with a tired smile. This group is unbelievable. Jimin looked back at Jungkook. The quiet understanding between them was stronger now. Not dramatic. Not uncertain. Just something new beginning. Come inside, Jimin said. Jungkook raised an eyebrow. Why? Because it's still my birthday. Jungkook laughed. That's true. And you still owe me another gift. Jungkook looked confused. I only brought the letter. Jimin smiled playfully. Then you'll have to stay longer. Jungkook understood the meaning behind the words immediately. He smiled. I can do that. They walked back into the apartment together. The noise returned instantly, Taehyung arguing about music, Hosok stealing another piece of cake, Namjoon trying to restore order. But something had changed. The letter that Jungkook had almost thrown away had done more than reveal a secret. It had opened a door neither of them had expected. And as the night slowly turned toward morning, both of them understood something simple and powerful. Some gifts weren't meant to be perfect. Some were meant to be honest. And sometimes, a single letter was enough to change a heart forever.